The pattern showed itself before the bodies did, which is not how these things usually work. Most killers announce themselves through excess, through a mess that demands attention. This one announced himself through absence, through spaces that should not have been empty and suddenly were. The first missing person report came from a transit authority supervisor who noticed that one of his night cleaners had not clocked out. The second came from a hospital administrator who could not account for a temporary orderly assigned to graveyard shifts. The third came from a motel manager who swore a long-term guest had simply vanished between checkout times that never arrived. Different neighborhoods, different employers, different lives. The only commonality was that all three people worked nights, all three moved through spaces no one paid attention to, and all three were last seen walking alone just before dawn. My name landed on the case because I had been the one to flag the overlap. I had spent enough years watching the city after midnight to recognize when it was being edited. I started with the motel, a low concrete structure near the industrial edge of town. The kind of place that existed because it was useful rather than wanted. The manager, a man who spoke quickly and avoided eye contact, told me the missing guest's name was Curtis Leland. He said Curtis paid in cash, kept to himself, and never caused trouble. He said Curtis had been staying there for 6 months and had not left behind anything personal enough to suggest intention. The room was stripped, but not cleaned. The bed was unmade. The bathroom sink held a ring of dried water. A paperback novel lay face down on the nightstand, its spine broken where someone had stopped reading abruptly. The window was unlocked. Nothing in the room suggested violence. That was becoming a theme. I pulled phone records next. Curtis's phone last pinged near a bus terminal at 5:12 a.m. 3 days earlier. The cleaner disappeared at 5:18. The orderly at 5:26. Each time, the signal cut off completely afterward. That kind of precision does not come from impulse. I visited the bus terminal myself before sunrise the next morning. The place hummed with early commuters and late survivors, people passing through one another without friction. Cameras covered most angles, but not all. There were blind spots created by structural pillars and outdated design. Someone patient could learn them. I watched footage until my eyes ached. At 5:10, Curtis appeared on screen, moving with the tired ease of someone who had learned how to exist unnoticed. At 5:11, another man entered the frame. He was unremarkable in the way that matters most. Average height, neutral clothing, no hurry. He fell into step beside Curtis without touching him. They walked together for 20 seconds. Then they disappeared behind a pillar. Only one of them came out. There was no struggle visible, no sudden motion, no reason for anyone to look twice. I slowed the footage and watched it again. The man who walked away adjusted his jacket as he cleared the pillar. The gesture was small, habitual, and calm. I checked the timestamp against the other disappearances. The same blind spot existed at the hospital loading bay. The same at the maintenance corridor near the transit depot. The city had been built with gaps, and someone had learned how to use them. By the end of the week, we found the first body. He was submerged in a retention pond on the outskirts of town, weighted down carefully, arranged in a way that suggested respect rather than disposal. Curtis Leland had not been beaten. He had not been stabbed. He had been strangled with something narrow and flexible, applied slowly and released only when the body stopped resisting. The medical examiner told me the cause of death with clinical calm. I asked how long it would have taken. She told me long enough for the killer to adjust pressure and observe response. This was not about rage. This was about control. I stood at the edge of the pond and looked out over the still water. Someone had been taking people the city did not track closely and removing them without disruption. Someone had been practicing. Serial killers like to believe they are invisible. The truth is, they rely on everyone else agreeing not to look too hard. I intended to disappoint him. Once the first body surfaces, the city starts paying attention in the wrong ways. Fear moves faster than understanding, and rumor fills space where facts are still lining up. I shut that out and went back to the footage, because killers like this one leave their signatures in behavior, not spectacle. Curtis Leland's body told us more in death than it ever had in life. His clothes were clean. His pockets were empty except for a transit pass placed neatly back inside his wallet. There was no water in his lungs, which meant he was dead before he went into the pond. The knot used to secure the weight was precise, functional, and practiced. Not decorative, not rushed. That mattered. This was not someone improvising. I mapped the disappearances and the dump site together. The pond sat just far enough from the city to avoid casual discovery, but close enough to reach without drawing attention. It was accessible by a service road used mostly by maintenance crews and delivery trucks. Vehicles came and went there constantly. No one kept count. The missing cleaner was named Roland Beck. The orderly was Nathan Iorio. Their lives did not intersect on paper. Different ages, different backgrounds, different routines. When you remove the surface details, though, they shared a single trait. They existed on the margins of other people's schedules. They were present when no one was fully awake and gone before anyone noticed. That was not accidental. I spoke with coworkers, supervisors, and neighbors. No one described arguments. No one described threats. Every conversation ended the same way, with a pause and then an admission that they had not known the missing man very well. That was the point. The footage gave us something else when we expanded the window. The same man appeared near all three disappearances in the weeks leading up to them. Sometimes he passed through alone. Sometimes he lingered near vending machines or bulletin boards. Sometimes he simply stood where people naturally slowed down. He never interacted on camera long enough to register as suspicious. He was learning rhythm. I pulled stills and pinned them to the board. From one angle he looked heavier, from another leaner. His face never fully resolved. That was not bad luck. That was intent. He dressed to dissolve into context. I brought in a behavioral analyst, not because I needed a profile, but because I wanted confirmation of what I already suspected. The analyst said the killer derived satisfaction from orchestration rather than violence itself. He said the choice of victims suggested resentment toward people who moved unnoticed, not because they were invisible, but because they accepted it. I disagreed with him quietly. This was not resentment. This was identification. The killer was not punishing them for being unseen. He was selecting them because they were. We found the second body 2 days later, this one Nathan Iorio, placed beneath an overpass where rainwater collected in shallow pools. He had been positioned on his side, hands tucked close to his chest, eyes closed. The ligature marks were identical. The pressure had been applied with the same care. What changed was the timing. Nathan disappeared at 5:26 a.m. He was found at 5:26 p.m. That was not coincidence. That was a message. The killer was compressing the cycle. He was no longer content to wait. I stood under the overpass while traffic thundered overhead, drivers unaware of what lay beneath them. The noise was constant, flattening thought, erasing individuality. It was the kind of place no one claimed and no one defended. I understood then what the killer was doing. He was editing the city, removing people from transitional spaces and leaving them in others, as though testing how much absence it could tolerate before reacting. I returned to the footage and focused on the killer's posture. In each appearance, his head tilted slightly, as though listening rather than watching. He was not hunting randomly. He was responding to something internal, a schedule only he knew. The next disappearance would come sooner. It would come where attention was highest, not lowest. Serial killers escalate because repetition dulls sensation. This one escalated because he wanted to be seen, not recognized but acknowledged as present. I put out a quiet alert to night shift facilities across the city and told them to vary routines immediately. I told them to break patterns, even if it caused inconvenience. Some listened, some did not. At 4:58 the following morning, a security guard at a 24-hour distribution center failed to respond to a radio check. When I arrived, the guard booth was empty. The chair was pushed back. The coffee was still warm. The camera showed the same man stepping into frame. This time he looked directly at the lens before the feed went dead. The guard's name was Samuel Ortiz. He was 56 years old, divorced, and 6 months away from retiring. He worked nights because they were quieter, and because no one expected conversation. His booth sat at the edge of the distribution center lot, a glass box designed more for visibility than safety. That design choice had cost him his life. The camera failure lasted exactly 90 seconds. When the feed resumed, the booth was empty, the door hanging open just enough to suggest interruption rather than force. Whoever took him understood infrastructure well enough to know how long he could disappear without triggering alarms that mattered. That narrowed the field in a way profiles never do. This killer was not only patient, he was operational. I pulled the footage frame by frame before the blackout. The man stepped into view wearing a reflective vest, identical to the ones used by the facility. His badge was turned away from the camera. He did not rush. He raised one hand slightly, a gesture that suggested routine interaction. Samuel leaned forward in his chair. Trust is built from repetition, not familiarity. We canvassed the area immediately, but the killer had not taken Samuel far. The body was found before noon in a drainage culvert less than a mile away. The placement was tighter this time, more confined. Samuel had been seated, back against the concrete wall, head upright. His eyes were closed. The ligature marks were consistent, but there was something new. His hands were folded. That detail mattered more than the location. Folding someone's hands is an intimate act. It suggests completion. The medical examiner confirmed what I already suspected. Samuel had been alive longer than the others during the act. The pressure had been applied gradually, then eased, then reapplied. The killer had been listening, adjusting, waiting. I returned to the footage of the killer looking into the camera. That look was not defiance. It was acknowledgement. He wanted the city to know it had been altered by intention. I asked for records of night shift contractors, maintenance crews, and temporary workers with access to transit hubs, hospitals, and distribution centers. The list was long and unhelpful until I cross-referenced it with another variable: complaints. Every large system accumulates complaints, usually ignored, usually filed away. I searched for individuals who had been formally reprimanded for lingering, for being present without clear purpose, for crossing roles without permission. People who moved through space differently tend to attract notice eventually. One name surfaced repeatedly: Adrian Locke. Locke worked as a facilities logistics consultant, hired on short-term contracts to evaluate workflow efficiency. His job required him to observe movement patterns, identify bottlenecks, and recommend adjustments. He had access to night operations because he claimed they revealed truer behavior. His reports were thorough, unemotional, and often unsettling in their precision. He had also been let go quietly from 3 contracts after employees complained that he made them uncomfortable. No threats, no aggression. Just proximity held too long and questions asked without context. I pulled his photo. Average height, neutral features, the kind of face memory slides off. His schedule put him near every location where someone had disappeared. I went to his apartment that evening. It was clean in the way places are when nothing is meant to be kept. No photographs, no personal decoration. Furniture arranged for function rather than comfort. The refrigerator held prepared meals labeled by date and time. On the wall, above a narrow desk, hung a city map marked with colored pins. Blue for transit sites, green for medical facilities, yellow for industrial zones. Red pins marked where bodies had been found. There was one red pin still missing. I waited. Locke arrived just after midnight, carrying a small backpack and wearing the same neutral jacket I had seen on the footage. He stopped when he saw me. He did not ask who I was. He did not ask why I was there. He said he wondered how long it would take. I arrested him without resistance. In the interview room, he sat straight-backed, hands resting flat on the table. He spoke before I asked anything. He said people misunderstood absence. He said removal clarified structure. He said the city functioned better when noise was reduced. I asked why these men. He said they understood how to disappear. He said they had already accepted it. He said he was simply completing a process. I asked about the hands. He looked at me carefully and said order mattered at the end. I did not ask where the final body would be. I already knew. We found Roland Beck the next morning, placed in the one location on the map still unmarked, a pedestrian tunnel beneath the central station. He had been arranged the same way, hands folded, eyes closed. The pattern was complete. Locke never asked for anything. He did not ask to justify himself further. He did not ask to be understood. He had already decided his work spoke clearly. As I closed the file, I thought about how many people move through the city unseen, and how easily that can be mistaken for permission. The killer had not hunted in shadows. He had worked in plain sight, relying on systems built to overlook the quiet. The city adjusted. Procedures changed. Blind spots were reduced. Someone always notices eventually. The damage is deciding how much absence it takes before that happens. Locke stayed calm after the arrest in a way that felt rehearsed rather than earned. He did not ask for water. He did not ask for a phone call. He watched the room as though it were another system to be measured, cataloged, and reduced to function. I moved him from the interview room to holding once the basics were complete. I did not want him performing for anyone else. Killers like Locke do not crave chaos. They crave confirmation. While he waited, I went back through everything he had touched, his reports, his contracts, his correspondence. Efficiency language has a texture to it, and his writing was unusually clean. He did not describe people, he described flow. Human beings appeared only as units of delay or continuity. That explained the victim selection more clearly than any confession could. He had not chosen men who were weak. He had chosen men who already existed as background. In his mind, removing them did not disrupt order. It refined it. We searched his storage unit that afternoon. Inside, we found coils of narrow synthetic cord, neatly labeled by thickness and tensile strength. We found spare reflective vests from multiple companies. We found laminated access badges, all expired but visually convincing. Nothing was excessive. Nothing was theatrical. There were no souvenirs. That absence unsettled the team more than anything else. Serial killers usually keep something. A token. A reminder. Locke kept nothing, because memory was not the point. Completion was. I spoke with him again that evening, not to extract a confession, but to understand the boundary of his thinking. He answered questions directly, but never emotionally. When I asked if he understood what he had done, he said understanding was irrelevant. He said the outcome was measurable. He said the city had already adapted. I asked him if he had ever considered that the men he killed were more than functions. He said consideration slowed systems down. He said sentiment created inefficiency. I ended the interview there. Prolonging it would only have given him what he wanted, which was validation through attention. The families were notified one by one. There is no efficient way to do that work, and anyone who tries to optimize it should not be allowed near it. Each conversation took its own shape. Some wanted details. Some wanted silence. All of them wanted certainty. I gave them that much. The city responded the way cities always do after something like this. Committees formed. Lighting was improved. Camera coverage expanded. Training manuals were revised with new language about situational awareness and irregular interaction. The gaps Locke exploited narrowed, not because anyone had learned compassion, but because liability had found a voice. I walked the pedestrian tunnel beneath the central station late one night, long after the last body had been removed. The walls had been scrubbed clean. Fresh paint covered old grime. The space looked brighter, safer, and completely unaware of what it had held. That is how places recover. People do not. Locke was transferred out of my custody within the week. I did not attend any further proceedings. My part had ended with naming the pattern and stopping its continuation. What happened to him after that would be administrative, procedural, and far removed from the work that mattered. Before he left, he asked me one final question. He asked if I believed the city would notice the difference. I told him the truth. I told him the city would not notice what was gone, only what had been forced to change. He considered that for a moment and then nodded, as though confirming a hypothesis. When I returned to my office, the board was still covered in photographs, timelines, and maps. I took them down slowly, not because I needed the time, but because erasure should never feel casual. Serial killers like Locke believe they reveal hidden structures. What they actually reveal is how easily systems excuse indifference until it turns lethal. The city moved on. It always does. I stayed with the quiet for a while longer, listening for what absence sounds like when it no longer has teeth. The quiet after an arrest is deceptive. It feels like resolution, but it is really a vacuum where unfinished questions drift back into focus. Locke had been stopped, but his thinking had not been dismantled. Systems like his do not collapse when the operator is removed. They persist in smaller, less visible ways. I reviewed the remaining material from his apartment more carefully. There were no trophies, but there were records. Not journals in the traditional sense, but logs. Dates, locations, durations. Each entry documented time spent observing, time spent waiting, and time spent intervening. The language never acknowledged violence. It referred only to adjustments. One entry stood out because it did not end the way the others did. It described a transit maintenance corridor 2 months earlier, a man who fit the profile, and a window of opportunity that had been abandoned. The reason given was a deviation. Too many variables. Too much unpredictability. That suggested restraint, which is not something people like Locke are credited with. It also suggested something else. He had been learning, refining, and discarding methods that did not meet his internal standard. The murders we knew about were not his first attempts. They were his first successes. I tracked down the location from the abandoned entry and reviewed incident reports from that week. There was a brief note about a night janitor who had reported feeling followed, and then dismissed it as fatigue. No disappearance. No crime. Just discomfort that had been documented and forgotten. I spoke with the janitor. He remembered the night clearly. He said a man had walked beside him without speaking, matching his pace too precisely. He said the man had asked a question about shift schedules and then stopped abruptly when another worker appeared. He said he had felt measured, as though evaluated. Locke had not been interrupted by conscience. He had been interrupted by noise. That distinction mattered, because it meant he would have continued if left alone. The escalation would not have stopped at 4 victims. It would have accelerated as his confidence grew. I returned to holding one last time before Locke was transferred out of state. I did not intend to speak with him, but he requested it, and I allowed it because containment includes understanding exit conditions. He asked if I had found the incomplete entry. I did not answer. He smiled slightly, not with satisfaction, but with recognition. He said systems always leave traces when they are interrupted. He said the city would return to its defaults eventually. He said attention decays. I told him attention does, but records do not. I told him the people he targeted now had names attached to what he had done. I told him patterns lose power once they are described. He listened and then said something that stayed with me longer than the rest. He said description was just another form of organization. He said order could absorb anything. I ended the conversation there. In the days that followed, I met with planners, supervisors, and administrators who wanted assurances. They wanted to know where they had failed and how to prevent recurrence. I gave them specifics. I gave them blind spots, timing vulnerabilities, and access overlaps. I did not give them philosophy. That would have been a mistake. The city implemented changes, not out of moral clarity, but out of risk management. People moved in pairs. Routes shifted. Cameras covered what had once been ignored. The night became less efficient and more human. That was enough. One evening, weeks later, I stood again at the bus terminal where Curtis Leland had last been seen. Commuters moved past me in uneven streams, distracted and intact. The pillar that had hidden the first disappearance was now ringed with reflective tape, and a new camera mounted high above it. The gap was gone. Locke had believed the city would not notice what he removed. He had been right, briefly. What he underestimated was how loudly absence echoes once someone decides to listen. There was still one part left to this story, not in a file or a report, but in the way patterns end. Not with a final act of violence, but with the deliberate refusal to look away when nothing seems wrong. The last part never arrives with a signal. It settles in quietly, the way a routine changes without anyone announcing it. That is how this one ended. Not with a body or a call in the night, but with the slow collapse of a system that had relied on neglect to function. Months passed. No new disappearances followed. That was the obvious measure of success, the one administrators liked to point to, but it was not the one I trusted. Serial killers do not vanish cleanly from the world. They are interrupted, displaced, or replaced. What mattered was whether the conditions that had allowed Locke to operate still existed. I tested them myself. I walked the city after midnight, alone, moving through the same transitional spaces Locke had favored. I stood near vending machines, loading bays, pedestrian tunnels, and service corridors. I watched how long it took before someone noticed a man standing still where movement was expected. I counted the seconds. The number had shortened. Security guards checked in more often. Janitors worked in pairs. Transit staff acknowledged one another with quick nods that said, "I see you, even if I do not know you." None of it came from empathy. It came from policy. That did not matter. Presence was presence. I thought about Locke's insistence that order could absorb anything. He was right in one sense. Systems adapt. They incorporate damage and move forward. What he failed to account for was friction, the small human resistances that do not optimize well but interrupt clean lines. The families of the men he killed did not stay connected to one another. They did not form a group or a cause. Grief does not organize easily. Each loss remains specific, stubbornly individual. That, too, mattered. Locke had reduced his victims to functions. The aftermath refused to cooperate. I received one letter during that time, forwarded from another facility. It was from Locke. There was no return address. The message was brief and neatly written. He said the environment had changed. He said the city was louder now. He said he would have had to redesign everything. There was no apology. There was no threat. Just acknowledgement. I filed the letter and did not respond. On my last walk through the pedestrian tunnel, I stopped at the place where the final body had been found. People moved through without slowing, but not without awareness. A security camera hummed softly overhead. The walls still carried faint discolorations where old paint met new, a reminder that erasure is never perfect. That felt right. Serial killers like Locke believe they expose truths about the world. What they actually expose are habits of indifference that everyone else has agreed not to challenge. When those habits change, even slightly, the illusion of invisibility collapses. I went home before dawn, the city already shifting into its next shape. Somewhere, someone was walking a night shift that would end safely because another person had learned to look up instead of through. That was enough of an ending for me. Cases do not always close with justice or insight. Sometimes they close with interruption, and interruption, when it holds, is its own kind of resolution. Now, let's get right into the next story for tonight. The Crosswinds neighborhood sat above the shoreline, hidden behind hedges trimmed by people who never met the owners. The houses were large but careful, designed to signal permanence rather than excess. No one here locked their doors out of fear. They locked them out of habit. The patrol officer at the gate recognized me and lifted the tape. "They didn't hear anything," he said quietly, as if sound itself might still be listening. "No alarms, no neighbors called it in." "Who found them?" I asked. "The housekeeper," he said. "Came in at 8, walked right back out. Vomited in the hydrangeas. Inside, the air smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and something older beneath it. Money has a smell when it's been settled into a place long enough. This house smelled owned." They were in the dining room. Elliot and Marianne Holloway sat across from each other at the long walnut table, hands folded neatly in front of them, posture almost formal. They looked composed in a way that suggested intention rather than peace. 2 porcelain teacups sat between them, untouched. A third chair at the table was pulled back slightly, empty. They had been shot once each, execution style, precise and economical. No blood spray, no overturned furniture. Whoever did this did not rush, and they did not improvise. I stood there longer than protocol required, letting the room speak. Marianne's eyes were closed. Elliot's were open, fixed on the empty chair. "They weren't surprised," the medical examiner said beside me. Heart rate was already elevated, but not panicked. They knew why someone was there. "They invited them," I said. She nodded. "Or they expected them." The Holloways were fixtures here. Old money, charitable, aggressively private. Elliot had built a financial firm that specialized in managing wealth quietly, invisibly, the kind of firm that promised discretion as its primary product. Marianne had served on boards, hosted galas, and curated a public life that revealed nothing personal. People like this do not end up murdered without a reason that has been ripening for a long time. I moved through the house slowly. No forced entry. No missing valuables. The security system had been disabled from inside using a valid code. Someone had arrived as a guest and left as a memory. In the kitchen, a kettle sat warm on the stove. 3 mugs had been taken out, then only 2 returned to the sink. That third presence lingered everywhere once I started looking for it. Upstairs, the bedroom was immaculate. Bed made. Closets untouched. Nothing suggested a search or a struggle. This had not been about theft. It had been about punctuation. Downstairs again, I found the butler's pantry door ajar. Inside, a small safe stood open, empty except for a single envelope left behind deliberately. My name was written on the front. That was the moment the case stopped being elegant and started being personal. I did not open it yet. I do not know why. Some instincts are not strategic. They are protective. Outside the Holloway's adult son stood near the driveway, wrapped in a coat that did not belong to him. His name was Andrew, early 30s, clean, controlled. He had not cried. He had not yelled. He looked like someone trying to solve a problem rather than survive one. They were supposed to meet someone last night, he said when I approached. Who? I asked. He hesitated. They didn't say. Did they seem worried? I asked. He shook his head. Focused. Like they'd already made a decision. About what? I asked. He swallowed. About not backing down. That mattered. I asked where he had been. He told me. I asked who could confirm it. He answered without hesitation. I asked if his parents had enemies. He gave me a thin, almost amused smile. Everyone in this town has enemies. We just call them competitors. I stepped away and finally opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. No letterhead, no signature, just a sentence written in Marianne Holloway's precise hand. We chose not to protect him anymore. That was all. I stood there while the house continued to glow behind me, warm and untouched by consequence. Somewhere in this town, someone had been waiting years to hear those words, and someone else had decided they were worth killing for. This was not a robbery, it was not a rage killing. It was the end of an agreement, and whatever Elliot and Marianne Holloway had stopped protecting was now exposed, angry, and very much alive. The envelope went into evidence, but the sentence stayed with me. People who write something like that know exactly who will read it and when. This had been composed with timing in mind. I spoke to Andrew Holloway again before I left the property. He stood where the driveway curved out of sight of the house, as if distance might change the shape of what had happened. Your parents ever use language like that? I asked. Protect him. He frowned. They used to say they were stewards. That was their word. Of what? I asked. He looked back at the house. People's futures. That's vague, I said. That's intentional, he replied. Andrew told me his parents had canceled dinner plans the night before, without explanation. He said they had dressed formally anyway, as if honoring an obligation that could not be postponed. When I asked if that was unusual, he said yes, then corrected himself and said it had become less unusual recently. They stopped attending things, he said. Stopped hosting. Stopped returning calls. From whom? I asked. He hesitated. From people who don't like being told no. that narrowed things without clarifying them. At the precinct, I laid out the basics: no forced entry, no theft, controlled execution, a message left behind. The Holloways had not been targeted for what they owned, but for what they refused to continue doing. I pulled their firm's client list. It was short, selective, and aggressively redacted. The Holloways did not manage money for loud people. They managed it for careful ones. Old dynasties, quiet heirs, people who preferred outcomes over headlines. One name surfaced quickly once I cross-referenced recent withdrawals, legal disputes, and sealed settlements. Lucas Breyer, inherited manufacturing wealth, publicly philanthropic, privately litigious, a man who did not like friction between his desires and reality. Breyer had been involved in a federal investigation 3 years earlier that never materialized into charges. The case had collapsed quietly after key financial records became unavailable. Unavailable did not mean destroyed. It meant protected. I visited Breyer's estate the following afternoon. Larger than the Holloways, but less tasteful. Security was visible, which suggested anxiety. He met me in a sunroom overlooking a manicured lawn that felt aggressively alive. "Tragic business," he said, shaking my hand without warmth. "Elliot and Marianne were valuable." "People," I said. He smiled politely. "Of course." I asked where he had been the previous night. He told me. I asked who could confirm it. He gave me names that sounded rehearsed. "They ever protect you?" I asked. He blinked. "Protect me from what?" "Consequences," I said. He leaned back. "Is that what you think this is about?" "I think they stopped doing something," I replied. "And someone decided that couldn't stand." Breyer studied me, then laughed softly. "You're giving them too much credit." "Am I?" I asked. "They were facilitators," he said. "Not gatekeepers." "Then why kill them?" I asked. His smile thinned. "Because facilitators who change their minds become liabilities." That was the first honest thing he said. As I left his property, I received a call from the forensic team. The third teacup from the dining room had a partial print. Not Andrew's, not Breyer's. Someone else had been invited to that table. Someone the Holloways trusted enough to pour tea for. Someone who had listened to them say no. I drove back toward town as the sun dropped behind the hills, casting long shadows across streets built for comfort, not scrutiny. In places like this, violence rarely announces itself. It arrives dressed as inevitability, cleans up after itself, and leaves others to argue about whether it was preventable. The Holloways had made a choice. They had put it in writing. Now I had to find out who they had stopped protecting, and why that person believed murder was the only acceptable response. The partial print from the teacup came back overnight. It belonged to a woman named Celeste Armin, a private attorney whose name appeared nowhere in the Holloways, official records, and everywhere just beneath them. She specialized in trusts, sealed agreements, and something she described on her website as legacy risk management. The phrase meant nothing and everything. Celeste lived in town, 5 minutes from the Holloways, in a house smaller than theirs but closer to the water. When I knocked, she opened the door almost immediately, as if she had been expecting the sound. "I was wondering when you'd come," she said. That told me enough to step inside. Her living room was spare, more functional than inviting. Files sat stacked on a credenza, color-coded and unlabeled. People who work like that believe clarity is a form of control. "You were there last night," I said. "Yes," she replied. "They asked me to be." "To witness," I said. "To advise," she corrected. Witnessing implies passivity. "Did you drink tea?" I asked. She nodded. Marianne insisted. She always did when things were difficult. "Who else was there?" I asked. Celeste met my eyes. "No one." "That's not true," I said. "There was a third chair for a reason." She exhaled slowly, then walked to the window and looked out at the water. "He didn't stay long," she said. "He never does when he doesn't get what he wants." "Name," I said. "His name doesn't matter," she replied. "It does to me," I said. "And it's going to matter to a jury." She turned back, expression tightening. "They protected him for years," she said. "Not because they liked him, because they believed containment was better than exposure." "And then," I said. "And then they decided the cost was too high," she replied. "Not financially, morally. That word again. People reach for it when the law feels inadequate." "Who is he?" I asked. Celeste hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Nathaniel Swanson." The name rang no bells, which was exactly the point. "He's not wealthy," she continued. "Not originally. He manages wealth, not money, influence. He connects people who should never be connected and makes sure nothing traces back." "A broker," I said. "A shield," she corrected, "until the Holloways withdrew it." "Why now?" I asked. Celeste's voice dropped. "Because the Holloways discovered that one of the people he'd been protecting was a minor when it started, and that the money had been used to bury it. That changed the air in the room. They gave him a choice," she went on. "Turn over everything, names, records, or they would. And he chose murder." I said. "Yes," she replied, "but not himself." I waited. "He doesn't do his own violence," Celeste said. "He contracts it. Always has." That explained the precision, the lack of emotion, the punctuation. "Why leave the note?" I asked. Celeste's mouth tightened. "Because Marianne wanted it clear this wasn't about money. She wanted someone to know they'd stopped." "Someone like me," I said. "Yes," Celeste replied. "Someone who wouldn't negotiate." I left her house with more than I'd arrived with, and still not enough. Swanson was a ghost, and ghosts do not pull triggers. They convince others it's necessary. Back at the precinct, I briefed the team and put quiet eyes on Swanson's known associates. There were not many, but they were careful, insulated, and well paid. Late that night, I received a message from an unknown number. They weren't supposed to make it personal. I stared at the screen. "Neither were you," the message continued. I typed nothing back. People like this want engagement the way they want oxygen. But the message told me something important. Swanson knew I was now part of the equation, and that meant Elliot and Marianne Holloway were not the last decision he was willing to enforce with blood. I did not reply to the message. Silence unsettles people who are used to shaping outcomes through reaction. Instead, I followed the money in reverse. Nathaniel Swanson did not exist in the ways that mattered. No property in his name, no public-facing companies, no social footprint worth tracking, but the people around him left wakes. Shell firms dissolved after short, purposeful lives, consulting contracts that ended the moment scrutiny approached. Trusts administered by Celeste and others like her, always with layers designed to make responsibility feel theoretical. The Holloways had been one of those layers. I pulled every case Elliot Holloway's firm had touched in the last decade that involved sealed settlements and non-disclosure agreements tied to criminal exposure. There were more than I expected. Most were clean enough to justify discretion. One was not. It involved a former prep school coach, a donor with access and patience, and a settlement paid through 3 intermediaries before disappearing into a charitable foundation that never filed public reports. The timeline matched Celeste's warning. The victim had been underage. The complaint had been withdrawn quietly. The coach had relocated. The donor had thrived. Swanson's name never appeared, but the architecture did. I went back to the Holloway house once the technicians cleared out. The light had changed the rooms, daylight strips intent bare. In the dining room, the third chair was still pulled back slightly, its position deliberate. This had not been an ambush. It had been a meeting that failed. On the sideboard, beneath the framed photograph of the Holloways at a fundraiser, I found a thin indentation in the wood, the shape of a ring pressed down hard and held there. Stress leaves marks even when nothing moves. Upstairs, in Elliot's study, I found what I had missed the first time. A false bottom in a drawer, cut cleanly, hidden behind old stationery. Inside was a flash drive and a handwritten note in Elliot's hand. If you are reading this, we waited too long. The drive contained nothing explosive on its own. No videos, no recordings, just correspondence, dates, introductions, and confirmations. A ledger of connections, not crimes. It showed how Swanson placed people in proximity, and then stepped away before consequences arrived. It showed who benefited from silence. Most importantly, it showed who would panic if that silence broke. That afternoon, 2 things happened within minutes of each other. A private jet filed an amended flight plan out of a regional airport. Destination changed twice before settling on somewhere without an extradition treaty. And a security firm quietly doubled coverage at Breyer's estate. Swanson was moving pieces without showing his hand. I brought Andrew Holloway in again, not as a suspect, but as a witness to his parents' final weeks. He looked smaller this time, grief having replaced control. They were tired, he said after a long pause. Not afraid. Tired of carrying other people's weight. Did they tell you they were ending something? I asked. He nodded. My father said the only way to stop protecting monsters was to accept what came after. What did he think would come? I asked. Andrew swallowed. This. That night another message came through, shorter than the last. You think you found him. You haven't. I believed that was true in the narrow sense. Swanson would never stand in front of me. But systems like his only work when no one names the structure. Elliot and Marianne Holloway had named it. They had known exactly what it would cost. Now it was my turn to decide whether to finish what they started, knowing the same calculus applied. The first crack came from someone I was not expecting to hear from. Celeste Armand called just after midnight, her voice stripped of its usual precision. He's making mistakes, she said. Small ones. The kind people make when they've never been told no this directly. Swanson, I said. Yes, she replied. He's trying to move people who don't want to be moved. Where? I asked. She hesitated. I can't give you an address. You already gave me a name, I said. That line is behind you, she exhaled. He's meeting someone tomorrow night, someone expendable. He needs reassurance. From whom? I asked. From me, she said. Or what I represent. I let the silence stretch. This was not courage. It was exhaustion, finally outrunning fear. He won't show, I said. Not himself. No, she agreed, but he'll listen. The meeting was set for a private club overlooking the water The kind of place that billed itself as discreet, and mostly succeeded because no one asked what discretion actually protected. I did not go in. I did not need to. What mattered was who arrived and who waited. Swanson sent a surrogate. The man took a corner table, ordered nothing, and checked his phone at regular intervals. He wore a suit that cost more than most people's cars, and carried himself like someone used to speaking for others. He stayed 47 minutes and left when Celeste did not arrive. That told me Swanson was nervous. People like him do not fear exposure, they fear unpredictability. The next morning, Breyer's security detail was reduced, not increased. Subtle, confident, he thought the danger had passed. I paid him another visit. "You're being careless," I said once we were seated. He smiled. "You already tried intimidation." "I'm not here for that," I replied. "I'm here to tell you the Holloways weren't the only ones who changed their minds." That landed. "You think Swanson will protect you?" I continued. "He won't. He never does once someone becomes expensive." Breyer leaned back. "You're speculating." "I'm forecasting," I said, based on his pattern. He studied me, then said quietly, "He promised this would stay buried." "So did Elliot Holloway," I replied, "until it didn't." Breyer said nothing after that. By evening, Swanson's network began to contract. Accounts froze. Lawyers stopped returning calls. Silence spread. The wrong kind. The kind that signals abandonment. The final message came just before dawn. "You don't understand what you've disrupted." I typed back this time. "You never understood what you were hiding behind." There was no reply. 2 days later, federal warrants were unsealed. Not for Swanson. He would remain unreachable, an idea more than a man. But the people who had relied on him were suddenly very real, very exposed, and very alone. The Holloways' murders were formally closed as contract killings tied to obstruction and conspiracy. No names were spoken aloud in court. None needed to be. I stood on the bluff above Crosswinds one last time, looking down at the houses that would go on believing themselves insulated. Elliot and Marianne Holloway had lived long enough to decide that insulation was not the same as safety. They had chosen to stop protecting a system that fed on silence. It cost them everything. But the agreement they ended did not survive them. And in a town built on quiet understandings, that was the loudest outcome anyone could have imagined. The town absorbed the shock the way wealthy places always do, by tightening its boundaries and pretending nothing fundamental had changed. Fundraisers resumed. Boards reshuffled. New names replaced old ones on donor walls. The Holloway house sold within 3 months to a family that asked no questions and received no answers. But something had shifted underneath the polish. Andrew Holloway left town quietly. He did not sell the firm immediately. He dismantled it instead, piece by piece, unwinding accounts that had once depended on discretion as a substitute for ethics. Clients complained. Some threatened. None followed through. Threats lose power once people realize the shield they trusted no longer exists. Celeste Arman resigned from her practice 2 weeks after the warrants were unsealed. She cited health reasons. No one challenged her. She disappeared into a version of retirement that did not include interviews or consultancy. She had served her purpose, and she knew better than to linger once the balance changed. Nathaniel Crowhurst was never arrested. Men like him rarely are. What happened instead was quieter and more final. His name stopped opening doors. Calls went unanswered. Introductions stalled. People who once relied on him to smooth outcomes began distancing themselves, each convinced they were acting independently. That is how systems like his collapse, not from exposure but from isolation. The last time I thought about him was when an international wire transfer failed, because too many compliance flags triggered at once. Someone had built redundancy into silence, and once that redundancy became visible, it stopped functioning. I visited the Holloway graves on a gray morning when the town was still asleep. 2 stones, modest, no epitaphs. Andrew had chosen that deliberately. Nothing carved that could be repurposed. I stood there longer than necessary and thought about the envelope with my name on it, about Marianne's careful handwriting, about the moment they decided containment was no longer worth the cost. They had not been naive. They had been exhausted. As I walked back to my car, my phone buzzed once with a message from an unknown number. It didn't end him. I stopped, considered it, then typed back. It never does. It just ends the agreement. There was no reply. That was fine. Some stories resolve with arrests or confessions. Others resolve with collapse, with structures giving way under the weight they were never meant to carry forever. Elliot and Marianne Holloway had understood that better than most. They had lived inside a system built on protection and silence. They had died the moment they chose truth instead. And in a town that believed wealth made it untouchable, their choice had done the one thing violence never could. It changed the rules. Now, let's get right into another story for tonight. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It was not the peaceful kind that settles naturally, but the deliberate absence that follows interruption. The house sat at the end of a narrow road outside of town, surrounded by long grass and neglected fencing, and it looked like it had been holding its breath for days. The woman who called it in had not gone inside. She waited by her car with the engine running, arms crossed tightly against herself, eyes fixed on the front door as if it might move on its own. She said her brother had not answered his phone in 3 days. She said that was not like him. She said she had driven out that morning and found the door unlocked. I told her she did the right thing by stopping where she did. That reassurance mattered, even when it changed nothing. The house was a single-story structure, built decades earlier, the kind of place designed for quiet permanence rather than comfort. The door opened easily when I pushed it, and the air inside was stale but not decayed. That suggested time had passed, but not enough for neglect to fully take hold. The living room was orderly. Furniture was arranged with intention. Nothing appeared broken or disturbed. The television was off. The windows were closed. The place looked paused, rather than abandoned. I announced myself as I moved deeper into the house, not because I expected an answer, but because habit demands acknowledgement, even when it feels foolish. The hallway led to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. The first bedroom was empty, used mostly for storage. The second belonged to the missing man. He was seated in a chair beside the bed, head tilted slightly forward, hands resting on his thighs. He looked as though he had simply stopped in the middle of a thought. There was no blood. There were no visible injuries. His eyes were open, unfocused, reflecting nothing. Death had not been dramatic here. That was the problem. I checked for signs of life anyway. There were none. His skin was cool. Rigor had begun to set in, but not fully. The timeline was still flexible, which made it dangerous. The room told a restrained story. The bed was made. The dresser drawers were closed. A notebook sat on the nightstand, open to a blank page. A pen rested across it, aligned carefully. People who plan to write and then do not usually have a reason. I noticed the smell next. It was faint but distinct, something chemical layered beneath the ordinary scents of the room. Cleaning products came to mind, but the wrong kind, sharper and more precise. I stepped back and called for the medical examiner and forensic team. Until they arrived, the room belonged to memory and observation. The sister stood outside when I returned to the front yard. I told her her brother was dead. I did not soften the words. I watched her absorb them slowly, as though they needed to pass through layers of disbelief before settling somewhere real. She asked how. I told her we did not know yet. She said his name was Harold Finch. She said he kept to himself, but was not sick. She said he had retired early from his job as a high school chemistry teacher and spent most of his time reading and walking the property. She said he had no enemies that she knew of. People rarely do. When the medical examiner arrived, she worked quietly and methodically. She found no trauma, no signs of struggle, no natural cause immediately apparent. She said toxicology would be necessary. She said the smell I noticed mattered. That narrowed the shape of the death in ways I did not like. Back inside, I examined the kitchen. Everything was clean. Too clean. The trash had been emptied. The sink was dry. A single glass sat upside down on a towel beside the sink, washed and placed carefully. That matched the pen on the notebook. That matched the order in the rest of the house. People do not clean when they expect to be interrupted forever. On the kitchen counter, I found a folded piece of paper tucked beside the fruit bowl. It was not hidden, but it was not displayed either. The handwriting was precise, almost instructional. It contained a single line. I needed to be certain. At that moment, the silence in the house felt less like absence and more like intention. The note went into an evidence bag, but the sentence stayed with me. People rarely write without an audience in mind, even when they claim otherwise. Certainty is not a private desire. It is something people seek in response to doubt, pressure, or fear. The medical examiner confirmed time of death sometime late Sunday night, give or take several hours. She said there were no signs of a heart attack or stroke visible at autopsy. She said Harold Finch's organs appeared healthy for a man of his age. She said the faint chemical odor suggested ingestion rather than exposure. She said toxicology would tell us what, but not necessarily why. I walked the property while the team worked inside. The land behind the house sloped gently toward a tree line, the grass uneven and patchy from neglect rather than use. There were no footprints beyond the ordinary impressions left by Finch himself. No tire marks suggested visitors. Isolation had done its job well. Neighbors were scarce, but I spoke with the nearest one anyway, a man who lived nearly half a mile down the road. He said Finch was quiet but polite. He said they waved when they passed. He said he had not seen any cars come or go over the weekend. He said that was normal. I returned to the house and sat at the small kitchen table. The chair across from me was pushed in neatly. Finch had lived alone, but the space was arranged as though he expected company that never quite arrived. I went through his study next. Books lined the shelves, many of them technical, some philosophical. Several dealt with ethics and science, and the responsibility of knowledge. A framed photograph on the desk showed Finch much younger, standing with a group of students in a laboratory. He looked engaged, alert, alive in a way that teaching sometimes brings out. The computer was powered down. That felt deliberate. I asked a technician to retrieve the hard drive for analysis. The sister returned later that afternoon, calmer now, steadier. Grief had not softened her, but it had focused her. I asked about Finch's life since retirement. She said he had left the school abruptly 3 years earlier after an internal investigation. She said he had refused to talk about it. She said he withdrew after that, sold his house in town, and moved out here. I asked what the investigation had been about. She said the district never disclosed details. She said rumors involved improper conduct in a lab, but nothing criminal had ever been proven. She said Finch had always insisted he had done nothing wrong, but his voice had never carried certainty when he said it. That mattered. The toxicology report came back the next morning. Finch had ingested a rare compound, one not commonly available, but not impossible to obtain with the right knowledge. It caused respiratory failure quietly, without panic or pain. The dosage had been precise. The delivery had been intentional. This was not an accident. It was not an impulsive act. It was either suicide by design or murder by expertise. I went back to the note. I needed to be certain. If Finch had killed himself, certainty of what? If someone else had done it, certainty of silence. I requested the school district records tied to the investigation. They arrived reluctantly, heavy with redaction, but revealing enough. A student had been injured in a lab accident involving chemical exposure. Finch had supervised the lab. Procedures had been followed on paper. In practice, something had gone wrong. The student had survived, but with lasting neurological damage. The family had settled quietly. Finch had retired within weeks. I tracked down the student. His name was Lucas Merritt. He lived in a supported housing complex on the other side of the county. When I met him, his movements were careful, measured. His speech was slow but deliberate. He remembered Finch clearly. He said Finch had been kind. He said the accident had been no one's fault. He said he had been careless. He said Finch had told him not to say that responsibility mattered. I asked if he had seen Finch since. He said no. He said Finch had written him letters for a while, then they had stopped. I asked if Finch had ever expressed guilt. Lucas looked at me for a long moment and said Finch had wanted proof. Proof that the injury had not been caused by contamination. Proof that his formulas had been sound. That aligned with the books. That aligned with the note. Back at the house, the lab technician finished with Finch's computer. There were files, all dated recently, documenting chemical stability tests, simulations, and handwritten notes scanned into the system. Finch had been recreating the compound he ultimately ingested. He had tested its purity, its predictability, its margin of error. He had needed to be certain. The line between suicide and something more complicated began to blur. Finch had not simply chosen death. He had conducted an experiment with himself as the variable. The question was no longer who killed Harold Finch. The question was whether anyone else had helped him reach certainty, or whether knowledge alone had been enough to push him there. I stayed at the house longer than protocol required. There was no pressure to clear the scene quickly, because nothing about Finch's death was going to resolve itself through haste. This was a case that asked to be read rather than chased. The compound he ingested had not been purchased online or through any licensed distributor in the past year. That narrowed access sharply. Finch had either synthesized it himself or obtained it from someone with the capability and discretion to do so. Given his background, self-synthesis was not only possible but likely. That still left the question of intent, because capability does not explain motivation. I returned to the notebook on the nightstand. The blank page was not empty, because nothing had been written. It was empty, because something had been erased. Under angled light, faint impressions revealed pressure marks. Lines of thought pressed hard enough to bruise the paper beneath. He had written something, and then removed it carefully. Certainty does not always survive revision. I spoke again with his sister, this time at her home in town. Away from the property, she seemed less guarded, as though distance had reduced the weight of precision that clung to her brother's world. I asked about Finch's temperament growing up. She said he had always been exacting. She said mistakes unsettled him more than conflict ever had. She said he believed that if something went wrong, it was because someone had failed to understand it fully. I asked if he had been depressed. She considered the question seriously before answering. She said he had not seemed sad in the traditional sense. She said he had seemed occupied, as though his attention had narrowed to a single unresolved problem. That description fit the evidence too well. I went back through the school district file and focused on what was not emphasized. The chemical involved in the lab accident had been stable under normal conditions. The injury had occurred during a demonstration Finch had modified at the last moment, adjusting concentration to illustrate a theoretical point. The modification had been within accepted parameters, but close to the edge. The investigation had concluded that the accident was unforeseeable. Finch had never accepted that conclusion. He had spent 3 years trying to eliminate uncertainty. I returned to Lucas Merritt. This time I asked different questions. I asked if Finch had ever asked him for forgiveness. Lucas shook his head. He said Finch had asked him for honesty. He said Finch had wanted Lucas to admit fault, not for legal reasons but for clarity. Lucas said he had refused, not out of anger, but because he no longer knew what fault meant. I asked if Finch had ever mentioned ending his life. Lucas said no. He said Finch had spoken about resolution, not escape. He said Finch believed unanswered questions were a kind of contamination. That word stayed with me. Back at the lab, the toxicologist confirmed something I had suspected. The compound Finch ingested was not just lethal. It was diagnostic. Its behavior in the body would have differed depending on slight variations in formulation. Finch had adjusted those variables deliberately. He had not chosen the easiest death. He had chosen the most informative one. That made the note make sense. I needed to be certain was not an explanation for dying. It was a conclusion, reached through dying. I considered the possibility of coercion one last time, not because the evidence suggested it, but because obligation demands it. There were no communications indicating pressure, no visitors, no financial irregularities, no signs of intrusion. Everything pointed inward. The final report would call it a suicide, but that word felt insufficient. Finch had not acted out of despair. He had acted out of obsession, guided by a belief that truth, once isolated, justified any cost. When I left the house for the last time, the silence no longer felt interrupted. It felt complete. Finch had removed himself the way he removed variables, leaving behind a controlled environment and a conclusion only he believed mattered. Cases like this do not end with relief. They end with understanding, and understanding carries its own weight. I wrote the report carefully because language has a way of hardening decisions into permanence. I avoided adjectives that suggested drama or despair. I documented facts, processes, and conclusions. The cause of death was self-administered poisoning. The manner of death was suicide. The rationale existed outside the scope of the form. That should have been the end of it, but cases like Finch's do not stay contained. They linger in the gaps between categories, where intention does not behave the way the system expects it to. 3 days later, the lab technician called me back in. He had finished reconstructing Finch's handwritten notes from the pressure impressions on the erased page. The process was imprecise, more inference than recovery, but the result was legible enough to matter. The last sentence Finch wrote was not a farewell. It was a conditional statement. If the reaction remains stable, then the fault was never the compound. That line reframed everything. Finch had not been trying to determine whether the substance was lethal. He had already known that. He had been testing whether his modification 3 years earlier could have caused Lucas Merritt's injury. His death had been a control experiment. I returned to the school records with that in mind. The lab accident involved an unexpected reaction pathway, one that had been theorized but never observed under classroom conditions. Finch had adjusted concentration to demonstrate the theory, believing stability would hold. It had not. What Finch proved with his final act was not innocence. It was inevitability. Under the right conditions, the reaction destabilized exactly as it had that day in the lab. Lucas's injury had not been a fluke. It had been the predictable outcome of a decision Finch chose to make. Certainty, once reached, had not freed him. It had cornered him. I went to see Lucas one last time. I told him the case was closed. I told him Finch's death had been ruled a suicide. I did not tell him why Finch had done it. That knowledge would not have helped him heal, and it would not have restored what was lost. Lucas listened and nodded. He said he had always believed Finch knew more than he admitted. He said some teachers mistake understanding for permission. He said he did not hate Finch, but he did not forgive him either. That was as close to resolution as anyone was going to get. When I returned to my office, I placed Finch's file in storage and sat for a long time without moving. Most murders involve anger, greed, or fear. Finch's case involved none of those. It involved devotion to correctness taken to a terminal extreme. He had not died because he wanted to stop living. He had died because he refused to live with uncertainty. That distinction mattered to me more than it should have. The city went on, as it always does. Another call came in before the afternoon ended. Another problem wanted a name and a shape. I stood, took my coat, and left the office. Finch stayed behind, preserved in paper and memory, a reminder that obsession does not always look like madness. Sometimes it looks like discipline, patience, and a man sitting quietly in a chair, waiting for a result he already suspects he cannot survive. The file did not stay closed. 2 weeks after Finch's death, I received a call from the medical examiner. Not with urgency, but with the tone people use when they have discovered something inconvenient. She told me a second review of Finch's toxicology had revealed an anomaly. The compound he ingested was pure, exactly as his notes predicted, but there was a secondary agent present in trace amounts. It was not lethal on its own, but it altered absorption timing. That agent had not been part of Finch's documented synthesis. I returned to the house with a warrant that felt unnecessary but correct. The place had been sealed, untouched since I last left it. The air inside carried the same sterile stillness, but now it felt less like closure and more like preservation. In the study, I reviewed Finch's notes again, with narrower attention. He had documented everything related to the compound's behavior, except one variable. There was a gap in the timeline during the final week of his life, a stretch where no experiments were logged. Finch did not leave gaps unintentionally. The computer analysis filled part of that absence. An external drive had been connected to his system twice during that week. It was not among his belongings. Someone had brought it and taken it with them. I spoke with his sister again. This time, I asked if Finch had received visitors recently. She hesitated longer than before. Then she said there had been one man, older than Finch, who arrived one evening shortly before Harold died. She said Finch had introduced him only as a colleague. She said the visit had been brief and tense. She had assumed it was connected to the old investigation. I asked if she remembered his name. She said no. She said Finch had not used it. That omission mattered more than any detail she could have recalled. I went back to the school district records and looked beyond Finch. The internal investigation had involved another faculty member, someone who had signed off on Finch's modified demonstration. The name surfaced easily once I stopped assuming Finch had acted alone. Dr. Raymond Kessler had been the department chair at the time. He had approved the concentration adjustment. He had testified that Finch's calculations were sound. He had retired 6 months after Finch did, citing health reasons. Kessler now lived less than an hour away. When I visited him, he did not pretend confusion. He invited me in and sat across from me at a kitchen table, cluttered with prescription bottles and academic journals. His hands shook slightly when he poured water. He said Finch had contacted him recently. He said Finch had wanted to recreate the experiment, not to prove innocence, but to determine causality. He said Finch believed that if the reaction destabilized again, responsibility would be shared. I asked about the secondary agent. Kessler's eyes dropped to the table. He said Finch had not known about it. He said he had introduced it quietly, adjusting the formulation just enough to delay onset. He said Finch had planned to die quickly. He said he had wanted Finch to live long enough to know the result. I asked why. Kessler said Finch had been wrong to shoulder the burden alone. He said Finch's certainty would have destroyed him either way. He said knowledge should be endured, not escaped. I asked if Finch had known he was being altered. Kessler said no. That was the moment the case changed shape again. Finch had chosen death, but he had not chosen the conditions under which it occurred. Someone else had intervened, not to save him, but to make the conclusion unavoidable and shared. I arrested Kessler for criminal negligence resulting in death. He did not resist. He said Finch would have approved of the outcome. He said the data mattered. As I left, I understood something Finch never had. Certainty does not absolve responsibility. It only clarifies it. There was still one part left, the final accounting of a death that had been shaped by intellect, pride, and the quiet arrogance of men who believed understanding excused intervention. Kessler's confessions simplified the facts without easing their weight. He had not pushed Finch toward death, but he had reached into the process and altered it, believing that knowledge justified interference. That belief made the difference between a closed file and a criminal charge. Kessler waived his right to counsel during the initial interview. He spoke slowly, choosing words the way academics do when they are accustomed to being understood. He said Finch had been obsessed with isolating blame. He said Finch believed responsibility could be measured cleanly, assigned like a variable in an equation. Kessler said he disagreed. He said the lab accident had been the product of a system, not a single choice. I asked why he had not said that 3 years earlier. He said institutions do not reward shared guilt. He said Finch had been easier to let go. That admission mattered more than the chemical details. Finch had not been abandoned by uncertainty. He had been abandoned by colleagues who preferred precision in theory and distance in practice. The secondary agent Kessler introduced had delayed Finch's death by several minutes. During that time, Finch would have been conscious, aware enough to observe symptoms and confirm stability. Kessler said Finch deserved to know the truth before it ended. What Kessler never acknowledged was that he had decided Finch deserved to suffer for it. I completed the arrest paperwork without ceremony. There was no satisfaction in it. Kessler was not a predator. He was something quieter and more dangerous, a man who believed moral authority came from understanding rather than restraint. The final ruling classified Finch's death as homicide by criminal negligence. Finch's original intent did not disappear, but it no longer stood alone. 2 men had made choices that night, both believing they were entitled to decide how knowledge should be paid for. I returned to the house one last time before it was released back to the family. The rooms looked smaller now, stripped of evidence markers and equipment. The chair in the bedroom sat empty. angled slightly away from the bed. The notebook remained sealed in evidence, but I could still picture the pressure marks, the erased certainty. I stood there longer than necessary, thinking about how easily intelligence turns inward when it loses an audience. Finch had not wanted forgiveness. He had wanted a conclusion clean enough to survive scrutiny. Kessler had wanted absolution without exposure. Neither had understood that responsibility does not dissolve when shared. It multiplies. Outside, the air was warm, the land unchanged. Finch's sister arrived as I was leaving. I told her the case was resolved. I did not give details beyond what was required. She thanked me anyway, not because the outcome brought peace, but because uncertainty had finally been removed from her brother's death. As I drove away, I thought about how rarely violence looks like violence. Sometimes it looks like careful notes, erased pages, and a man sitting quietly, convinced that truth, once proven, would take care of the rest. It never does. I filed the last document that evening and shut off the light in my office. Another story was finished, not because it made sense, but because all the choices that shaped it had finally been named. Now, let's jump right into the next story for tonight. I was reviewing surveillance transcripts when the phone rang, and the sound cut through the quiet of the office with surgical precision. The hour was early but not delicate, the kind of morning when the city had already made its first compromises. Dispatch did not dramatize the message, which told me everything I needed to know. There was a body at the South Pier, discovered inside an abandoned warehouse, and the responding officers wanted a detective on scene immediately. I took my coat, locked the file drawer, and left without ceremony. I did not rush, because rushing never improved clarity, and clarity was the only currency that mattered at the beginning of a case. The waterfront looked drained of color when I arrived, as though the night had wrung it dry and left it to stiffen in the cold air. The fog hung low, but not thick, allowing shapes to exist without detail. Police tape marked the perimeter, and uniformed officers stood in positions that suggested routine rather than alarm. That told me the violence had already happened, and whatever answers existed would not volunteer themselves. Inside the warehouse, the space opened wide and empty, its ceiling high enough to swallow sound. The floor was stained with decades of neglect, darkened by oil and water and time. The body lay closer to the center than I expected, positioned in a way that immediately signaled intent. People who collapse do not arrange themselves. He was a man in his late 40s or early 50s, Caucasian, well-groomed, wearing a charcoal suit that fit him properly. The jacket was buttoned. The tie was straight. His hands rested at his sides with the palms turned inward, and his shoes were clean enough to suggest he had not walked far inside the building. There was a wound to the chest, just left of center, where the fabric had darkened and stiffened. There was no visible weapon. I crouched beside him and studied his face. His eyes were open, unfocused, carrying no expression beyond surprise. Death had reached him quickly enough to interrupt whatever thought he had been forming. I checked for identification and found a wallet in his inner pocket. The name read Gregory Malloy. The address placed him in a condominium overlooking the river, several miles north of where he now lay. The cards inside the wallet suggested a man who did business confidently and expected continuity. A forensic tech named Alvarez approached and waited until I looked up. He spoke evenly, aware that the room carried sound too well. He said the time of death was estimated between midnight and 2 in the morning, based on body temperature and lividity. He said the wound was likely inflicted by a narrow blade, possibly a stiletto or something similar, driven straight in with considerable force. He added that there were no defensive wounds. which suggested either trust or surprise. I stood and took in the rest of the space. There were no signs of a struggle. There were no overturned objects, no scattered debris that did not already belong to the building. This was not where violence had erupted. This was where violence had concluded. Near the eastern wall, I noticed faint scuff marks on the concrete, barely visible unless you were looking for them. They ran in a short line and then stopped. I asked Alvarez to photograph them and mark the area. He nodded and went to work without comment. Outside, the dockworkers still lingered behind the tape. I walked over and identified myself. One of them, a man with a deeply lined face and a voice worn down by years of shouting over engines, said they had arrived at 5 and found the warehouse door ajar. He said that was unusual because even abandoned buildings develop habits, and this one usually stayed shut. He said they did not go inside because they knew better. I asked if they had seen anyone in the area during the night. He shook his head and said the fog had been light but persistent, and the pier had been quiet. He added that quiet at the waterfront was never empty, only patient. Back inside, I spoke briefly with the patrol sergeant, who confirmed there were no cameras inside the warehouse and only 2 functioning ones outside, both with partial views obscured by age and corrosion. He said the footage had been pulled and sent for review. I returned my attention to Gregory Malloy. His suit was expensive. His hands were clean. There was no sign that he had been bound or restrained. Whatever brought him here had done so without resistance. People do not wander into abandoned warehouses at night unless they believe they have reason to be there. As I straightened, something caught my eye near the edge of the floor, close to where the wall met the concrete. It was small and easily missed, but it did not belong. I pointed it out to Alvarez, who carefully retrieved it with gloved fingers. It was a cufflink, silver, engraved with a simple geometric pattern. The other was missing. That detail mattered more than it should have. Men who wear cufflinks tend to be deliberate, and deliberate men do not lose things by accident. I took one last look at the body before stepping back into the light. The fog had begun to lift, revealing the water beyond the pier, flat and indifferent. Somewhere between Gregory Malloy's condominium and this warehouse, a decision had been made. My job was to find where that decision began, and who had benefited from its conclusion. Malloy's address put him in a glass tower overlooking the river, the kind of building that advertised security as a lifestyle rather than a function. The lobby smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and money that had never worried about leaving. A uniformed guard checked my badge and called upstairs before directing me toward the elevators with the practiced neutrality of someone trained to forget faces. The condominium was on the 23rd floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows faced east, where the river bent and widened, reflecting the pale morning light like a sheet of dull metal. The place was immaculate, in a way that suggested routine maintenance rather than panic. No drawers were open, no furniture had been moved. The bed was made with hospital corners that implied either discipline or hired help. I walked the space slowly, letting the quiet settle. People leave traces even when they think they are careful. The kitchen counters were wiped clean, but the trash had not been taken out. Inside, I found a single wine bottle, empty, and 2 glasses washed and set on a drying mat. That suggested company. It also suggested time, because people who are rushing do not clean glassware. In the bedroom, the closet held suits arranged by color, shoes aligned beneath them, like obedient shadows. On the dresser sat a watch placed face down, its leather strap unbuckled. I picked it up and checked the timestamp. It had stopped at 12:47 a.m. That was close enough to our window to feel intentional. There were no signs of forced entry. The door locks showed no damage. Whatever had brought Malloy out after midnight had done so willingly. Trust narrows the list faster than fear ever does. I spoke with the building manager, a woman in her early 60s who had perfected the art of appearing helpful without becoming involved. She told me Malloy lived alone and kept regular hours. She said he entertained occasionally, but never loudly. She said he had no known disputes with neighbors. When I asked about guests the previous night, she hesitated just long enough to matter. She said a woman had signed in just before 10. She said the name was Evelyn Parker. She said the woman left a little after midnight, alone. I asked for the security footage. The manager agreed without protest, which told me she understood the gravity even if she did not welcome it. Back at the precinct, I reviewed the footage in a windowless room that smelled faintly of old carpet and newer electronics. Evelyn Parker appeared on screen dressed in a dark coat that reached her knees, her hair pulled back neatly. She moved with ease, as though she belonged anywhere she chose to stand. When she left the building, she did not rush. She did not look back. I ran the name through our system. There were several Evelyn Parkers, which was not surprising, but one matched the age range and had a prior connection to Malloy through a limited liability company dissolved 3 years earlier. The company had been involved in property development along the waterfront, including the South Pier area. The files showed disputes, lawsuits, and a settlement sealed by agreement. I requested the settlement documents and waited. While I did, Alvarez stopped by my desk with an update from the autopsy. He said the blade had punctured the heart cleanly. He said death would have been nearly immediate. He said there were trace fibers on the wound edges, dark wool or synthetic blend, possibly from clothing rather than a glove. He added that there were no drugs or alcohol in Malloy's system beyond a single glass of wine. That aligned with the scene at the condominium. 2 glasses, 1 bottle, conversation without intoxication. The settlement documents arrived just after noon. Malloy had been the majority partner. Parker had been forced out after alleging financial misconduct. The case had ended quietly, with compensation and a non-disclosure agreement. Silence had been purchased, but silence rarely holds forever. I drove to Parker's listed address, a townhouse on a narrow street several blocks inland from the river. The neighborhood was older, quieter, the kind of place where people noticed cars that did not belong. When I knocked, she answered without surprise. Up close, she looked older than she had on the footage, but not diminished. Her eyes were steady. Her posture was controlled. She invited me in without asking why I was there. We sat at a small dining table. She poured coffee and slid the cup toward me. I did not drink it. I told her Gregory Malloy was dead. I watched her face carefully as the words landed. There was no shock, but there was acknowledgement, as though she had been carrying the possibility and was now setting it down. She said she had seen him the night before. She said they had talked about the past. She said nothing had been resolved, but nothing had escalated either. She said she had left before midnight and gone straight home. I asked about the cufflinks. Her eyes flicked, just briefly, to her wrist, where she wore a watch with a silver clasp. The geometric pattern matched the one we had found. She said the cufflinks had been a gift. She said Malloy had always liked symmetry. She said he had lost one years ago. I asked why he would agree to meet her after everything that had happened. She said some men believed control was permanent, even after it was proven otherwise. She said he had called her, not the other way around. She said he had sounded nervous. I asked if she knew the warehouse on the South Pier. She said she knew it well. She said the company had planned to renovate it before everything collapsed. When I left, she did not ask if she was under arrest. She did not ask what would happen next. She watched me go with the same steady attention she had given me all morning. Outside, the street was quiet. Somewhere between Malloy's watch stopping at 12:47 and the warehouse floor marked by scuffed concrete, the truth was narrowing. It was not yet complete, but it was beginning to take shape, and it carried the weight of intention rather than impulse. I returned to the South Pier in the afternoon, when the light was less forgiving and the fog had burned off completely. The warehouse looked smaller in daylight, stripped of whatever menace the night had lent it. That made the choice to use it more deliberate, not less. People who select familiar places for violence are usually revisiting something unfinished. The scuff marks on the concrete were clearer now. They ran parallel for a short distance, uneven in depth, consistent with heels being dragged rather than feet being planted. That suggested resistance at the very end, not at the beginning. I tried to reconstruct the moment without embellishment. Malloy would have arrived confident enough to walk in on his own. Whatever changed his mind had happened after he crossed the threshold. A patrol officer approached and told me they had pulled partial license plate data from one of the exterior cameras. The image was degraded, but the vehicle was a dark sedan, mid-size, with damage to the rear bumper. That narrowed nothing on its own, but it gave the night a shape. Back at the precinct, I requested financials on Malloy's recent activity. Money moves even when people believe it is standing still. The report showed several withdrawals in the weeks leading up to his death, each just below the threshold that would require automatic reporting. The total was substantial. He had been preparing for something, or paying for it. I also pulled Parker's financials. There was no sudden influx of cash. There was no sign of desperation either. Her accounts were steady, modestly growing, disciplined. If this had been about money, it had not been about hers. I spoke with the assistant district attorney assigned to the case, a man who measured risk the way other people measured time. He wanted probable cause before we moved on Parker. I told him we were not there yet, and he nodded, relieved not to have to say no himself. That afternoon, Alvarez called me down to the lab. He had something he wanted me to see in person. On the table sat the cufflink, cleaned and catalogued. Under magnification, there was a faint smear along one edge. He said it was skin, not blood, likely transferred during a struggle. He said they were running DNA, but it would take time. He also showed me fibers recovered from Malloy's wound. They matched the coat Parker wore in the footage. That alone was not enough, because proximity could explain transfer. What mattered was quantity, and the quantity suggested pressure. I drove back to Parker's townhouse as the sun began to sink. This time her car was parked out front, a dark sedan with a dented rear bumper. The damage looked old, but old was relative when it came to lies. She answered the door again. This time, I did not sit. I told her about the fibers, I told her about the cufflink, I told her about the car. I watched her carefully as I spoke, not for panic, but for calculation. She listened without interruption. She said she had gone to the warehouse with him. She said he had insisted on seeing it one last time, as though standing in the ruin might absolve him. She said she had agreed, because she wanted to hear him say what he never had. She said inside the building he admitted to everything. He admitted to siphoning funds, falsifying reports, and forcing her out to protect himself. She said he had smiled when he said it, as though confession were another form of control. She said she had told him she would go to the authorities. She said he laughed. She said he reached into his jacket, and she believed he was reaching for a weapon. She said she reacted. I asked where the knife came from. She said it had been in her coat pocket, something she carried for years without thinking. She said she had never used it before. I asked why there were no defensive wounds on him. She said there had been no time. I asked why she had cleaned the glasses and returned home calmly. She said panic was a luxury she could not afford. Her story aligned too neatly. That did not make it false, but it made it incomplete. People rarely confess to more than they believe you can prove. I arrested her anyway. The evidence was sufficient, even if the motive was still blurred by perspective. Later that night, alone in my office, I reviewed the case file again. The financial withdrawals bothered me. The timing bothered me. Malloy had been afraid enough to move money quietly, but confident enough to meet Parker alone. That contradiction suggested a third presence, someone he feared more than her. The DNA results came back just before midnight. The skin on the cufflink was male. It did not belong to Malloy. That was the moment the case shifted. Parker had been telling the truth, but not the whole of it. She had gone to the warehouse, but she had not delivered the final act. Someone else had been there, close enough to leave a mark, close enough to finish what had begun. The question was no longer whether Parker had motive. The question was, who else had reason to ensure Gregory Malloy never left that building alive? I had Parker transferred to holding rather than a cell. It was not mercy. It was practicality. People who are partly guilty are more useful when they still believe cooperation matters. The male DNA from the cufflink did not match anything in our system, which meant the person had either never been arrested or had learned early how to avoid leaving records behind. That narrowed the field in a different way. Malloy had not been afraid of ghosts. He had been afraid of someone tangible. I went back through the financials with a narrower lens. The withdrawals were not random. They coincided with deposits into an escrow account tied to a shell corporation registered out of state. The name on the filings meant nothing, but the attorney of record did. His name was Walter Kincaid, a specialist in quiet dissolutions and quieter negotiations. I had crossed paths with him before, always at the edges of cases that never quite broke open. I paid him a visit the next morning. His office occupied the top floor of a renovated factory downtown, all exposed brick and tasteful restraint. He greeted me politely and offered water, which I declined. We sat across from each other at a desk too clean to suggest real work. I asked about Gregory Malloy. He smiled faintly and said client confidentiality limited what he could discuss. I told him Malloy was dead. The smile faded, replaced by calculation. I told him I was interested in the escrow account and the withdrawals that fed it. He said Malloy had been arranging a buyout. I asked of whom. He said of a silent partner who had grown impatient. That was the first time anyone had mentioned a third party without being prompted. I pressed him. He said the partner had financed several of Malloy's developments, including the South Pier project. He said the partner had remained unnamed by design, preferring influence without exposure. He said Malloy had recently failed to deliver on a promise, and the relationship had deteriorated. I asked for a name. He said he could not give me one without a subpoena. I told him he would have one by the end of the day. He nodded, already preparing himself to comply while appearing reluctant. Back at the precinct, I spoke with Parker again. This time, I told her about the silent partner. I told her about the escrow account. I watched her expression change, not into fear, but into recognition. She said Malloy had always had backing he could not fully explain. She said money appeared when it was needed, and disappeared when questions were asked. She said she had suspected organized influence, but suspicion had never been enough to act on. I asked if Malloy had mentioned meeting anyone else that night. She hesitated. Then she said he had taken a call while she was there, stepped into the bedroom, and returned pale and distracted. She said he had insisted they go to the warehouse immediately afterward. That aligned with the watch stopping at 12:47. That aligned with urgency. The subpoena did its work. Kincaid's files identified the silent partner as Marcus Bell, a private equity operator with a history of aggressive acquisitions and a talent for staying just outside criminal reach. Bell had been questioned in the past and charged never. His money moved through layers designed to exhaust anyone who followed it. Bell owned a dark sedan with a repaired rear bumper. I requested surveillance on Bell's movements the night of the murder. Traffic cameras caught his vehicle entering the waterfront district shortly after 1 in the morning and leaving 20 minutes later. That placed him at the warehouse within the window of death. When I brought Bell in, he did not pretend surprise. He wore a tailored coat and carried himself like someone accustomed to being waited for. He denied killing Malloy. He admitted to being at the warehouse. He said he had gone there to confront a failing investment. He said Malloy had already been injured when he arrived. He said Parker was there, standing over him, shaking. He said he had tried to help and had gotten blood on his hands. He said Malloy had died before he could do anything. His story accounted for the DNA, but not the wound. The blade had been driven with precision, not panic. Bell's hands were steady, practiced. Parker's were not. I laid out the evidence, the fibers, the timing, the financial pressure. I told him Malloy had been preparing to pay him off and disappear. I told him that kind of exit threatened Bell's control. Bell listened, unimpressed. He said control was an illusion people like me clung to. He said Malloy had been a liability, but liabilities could be managed without murder. I let him talk. People like Bell always reveal themselves eventually, not through confession, but through correction. He said the knife had gone in too cleanly to be Parker's work. That was the mistake. Only the killer would know that. Parker had never described the wound in detail. Neither had the autopsy report been released. Bell stopped speaking. The room held the silence for him. I arrested him for the murder of Gregory Malloy. The truth, when it finally surfaced, was not dramatic. Bell had arrived to find Parker threatening Malloy with exposure. Bell had intervened, not to save Malloy, but to silence him permanently. Parker had been a witness, not the executioner. Her knife had never left her pocket. Bell had taken the blade from her during the confrontation and used it with efficiency. Control had not been an illusion to him. It had been a habit. As I completed the paperwork late that night, I thought about the warehouse and the way unfinished places invite unfinished business. Malloy had built his life on leverage and silence. In the end, both had turned against him. The case was nearly closed. One part remained. I still had to decide how much of Parker's involvement belonged in the final report, and how much belonged to the quieter understanding that sometimes survival and guilt share the same space. The assistant district attorney did not like ambiguity, but he understood leverage when he saw it. I laid out Parker's role exactly as it had unfolded, neither softened nor sharpened. She had gone to the warehouse intending confrontation, not violence. She had carried a knife, which complicated things, but she had not used it. Bell had. The evidence supported that version, even if it did not flatter anyone involved. The ADA agreed to hold off on charging Parker pending Bell's arraignment. That was not an act of faith. It was strategy. Bell's defense would look for fractures, and Parker was the most obvious fault line. If she testified cleanly, Bell would have fewer places to hide. I spoke with Parker one last time before Bell's initial hearing. She sat across from me in the interview room, hands folded, posture unchanged. Jail had not altered her. It had only clarified her patience. I told her Bell had been arrested. I told her why. I told her what would be expected of her next. She nodded once. She said she had assumed Bell would finish it the moment he walked in. She said she had seen that kind of man before, men who solved problems by removing them. She said she had hoped Malloy would live long enough to be exposed. She said hope had never been her strongest instinct. I asked why she had not stopped Bell. She met my eyes and said, "Some moments move faster than intention." She said when Bell took the knife from her hand, she understood exactly how the night would end, and she understood that stepping in would only add her name to the floor. That answer rang true because it was not self-serving. It did not excuse her presence or her silence. It simply described them. Bell's hearing was brief. He stood at the defense table without visible strain, listening as the charges were read. Murder in the first degree, aggravating circumstances tied to financial coercion and premeditation. His attorney asked for bail. The judge denied it without hesitation. As Bell was led away, he glanced at me once. There was no anger in his expression. There was something closer to irritation, as though a mechanism he trusted had finally failed. Men like Bell do not rage when they lose. They calculate how much loss they can endure. The weeks that followed were procedural and heavy. Subpoenas were answered. Financial webs were untangled. The Shell Corporation collapsed under scrutiny, revealing a network of transactions designed to keep Bell insulated. That insulation thinned quickly once light reached it. Malloy had not been the only liability Bell had managed. He had simply been the last one, careless enough to believe he could exit cleanly. Parker was released under supervision. The knife was logged, photographed, and returned to evidence storage, its significance reduced to context rather than cause. She did not thank me when she walked out. She did not need to. Survival had already cost her more than gratitude could cover. One evening, long after the building had emptied, I sat alone in my office and reread the final draft of the report. It was accurate. It was thorough. It was also incomplete in the way all honest accounts are. There were moments that could not be footnoted, decisions made in silence that no document could justify or condemn. The warehouse on the South Pier was scheduled for demolition. The city had decided the land was worth more cleared than remembered. That felt appropriate. Places like that accumulate weight until they either collapse or are erased. I thought about Malloy standing in the center of that empty space, still believing in leverage even as it failed him. I thought about Parker watching the knife change hands. I thought about Bell mistaking efficiency for immunity. Cases end. Consequences ripple. The work moves on. There was still one part left to play out, the final tightening of the story in open court, where truth would be filtered through language designed to win rather than understand. That would come soon enough. For now, the file was closed, the night was quiet, and the city outside my window carried on, indifferent as ever to the cost of the decisions made in its name. The trial moved faster than I expected and slower than it should have. Bell's attorneys tried to bury the jury under complexity, hoping volume would substitute for doubt. They spoke about investment structures, fiduciary gray areas, and business disputes that had escalated beyond intention. They avoided the warehouse as long as they could, as though distance might dull its edges. When Parker took the stand, the room shifted. She did not perform. She did not plead. She answered questions with precision and restraint, describing the meeting, the call that changed Malloy's demeanor, and the moment Bell entered the warehouse with authority that had not been earned that night, but had been practiced for years. She described the knife leaving her hand. She described stepping back, because stepping forward would have meant dying. Bell watched her without expression. That was the tell. Men who are falsely accused react to witnesses. Men who are accurately described study outcomes. The forensic testimony closed the loop. The blade angle, the depth, the force. It all pointed away from Parker and towards someone accustomed to decisive action. The DNA placed Bell's hand where it belonged, and his own words in the interview room did the rest. Jurors remember corrections more clearly than denials. Bell did not testify. That was his right. It was also his mistake. He believed silence preserved control. It never does. It only cedes the narrative to those willing to speak plainly. The verdict came back guilty on all counts. There was no outburst. Bell nodded once, as though acknowledging a transaction finalized against his preference. The judge sentenced him to life without parole. The language was formal. The outcome was permanent. Afterward, I stood alone in the corridor while the room emptied. Parker passed me on her way out, escorted but no longer restrained. She stopped briefly and said she would leave the city. She said some places never let go of what they witness. I told her that was true. I did not tell her that leaving did not guarantee release. The demolition of the warehouse began 2 weeks later. Concrete gave way to machinery. The floor where Malloy had fallen was broken into fragments and hauled off without ceremony. No marker was placed. No one asked for one. I closed the file for the final time on a quiet afternoon. Bell's reach unraveled steadily after his conviction, partners scattering, money freezing mid-transfer. The system corrected itself the way it always does, slowly and without apology. That night, I walked the pier alone. The water moved the same way it always had, indifferent and patient. I thought about how many decisions converge in a single moment, and how rarely the person lying on the floor understands which one sealed it. The city did not change because of Gregory Malloy's death. It never does. It simply absorbed the lesson and waited for the next person confident enough to believe control could be permanent. I turned back toward the street and went home.